He didn't sign anything, he didn't borrow. He didn't agree, he didn't choose. And yet he owed money before he could speak. Before he could walk across the dirt floor of the house where he was born, his name already existed on parchment. Written smaller than his father's, but close enough to be counted the same. In medieval times, debt didn't wait for adulthood. It didn't wait for consent. It didn't wait for mistakes. It followed blood. When his mother held him for the first time, the number already existed. Quiet, patient, certain. No one told him about it when he was a child. There was no reason to. Children weren't protected from debt. They were prepared for it. He grew up learning the rules without ever hearing them explained. Work early, ask little, expect nothing. Stay where you are. The system didn't need to announce itself. It surrounded him. This is the story of a man who was never free, not for a single day of his life, because the system decided that debt could be inherited, just like land hunger and obedience. And once you were born into it, escape was not an option. He was born during a bad season. Not catastrophic, just bad enough. The kind of year where grain was thinner, payments were tighter, and patience was shorter. The kind of year where survival required more calculation than hope. His father already owed money when he was born. Everyone did. Debt was not an exception in the village. It was the baseline. What mattered was not whether you owed, but how visible your debt was. Some debts were tolerated, others were watched. His father's debt had existed long enough to become familiar. Adjusted year after year, never erased, never settled, only reshaped. When the child was born, nothing about the debt changed officially. But in practice, everything did. The household had gained another obligation, another mouth, another future worker. Another body tied to the same numbers. No ceremony marked the transfer. No document was read aloud. Debt didn't need witnesses. It assumed continuity. As the child grew, the debt grew quietly with him. Not in amount, in certainty. From the beginning, the system treated his life as collateral. No one sat him down to explain debt. There was no lesson, no warning, no moment where the truth was spoken clearly. That would have made it feel deliberate. And the system did not want to feel deliberate. It wanted to feel natural. He learned debt the same way he learned hunger and cold, by repetition. As a child, he noticed patterns before he understood meanings. He noticed that adults spoke differently when certain names were mentioned, that some doors were knocked on gently, while others were approached with caution, that certain days of the year brought tension into the house, even when nothing obvious happened. Those were payment days. He didn't know the word yet, but he knew the feeling. The way his father became quieter. The way his mother measured food more carefully. The way arguments stopped, not because problems were solved, but because they were postponed. Obedience was taught indirectly. Don't draw attention. Do what you're told. Be useful. Usefulness was protection. Children who were useful were tolerated. Children who were not were noticed. And notice was dangerous. By the time he was strong enough to carry water, he was strong enough to work. No one called it labor. It was helping, it was learning, it was preparing for what was never said out loud. He learned to wake early, to move quickly, to stay quiet when adults spoke about money, to understand that certain conversations were not meant for him, not because they were inappropriate, but because they were inevitable. Debt was not something you discussed. It was something you managed around. He watched his father count coins at night, spreading them carefully on the table, rearranging them, removing some, adding others. The numbers never seemed to change in a meaningful way. The ritual itself mattered more than the result. Rituals created the illusion of control. As he grew older, obedience became more explicit. Not enforced with punishment, but with consequence. Children who disobeyed didn't bring shame. They brought cost. A broken tool, a lost day of work, an angry response from someone who mattered. Everything had a price, and the price was never abstract. By adolescence, he understood his role clearly. He was not being raised to choose, he was being raised to continue. Continue the work, continue the payments, continue the silence. No one said, "This debt will be yours." They didn't need to. The system did not rely on announcement. It relied on expectation. He learned to obey long before he learned to question. And by the time questions formed, obedience already felt like survival. Work was introduced as the solution to everything. If money was short, work more. If debt grew, work harder. If hope faded, work anyway. Work was framed as virtue, as redemption. as the one thing that could not be taken away. That was the lie. He began working full days before his body was ready. His hands toughened quickly, his back learned strain early. Pain became familiar enough to be ignored. No one praised him for working. Praise suggested excess. Work was expected. The system did not reward effort. It normalized it. Each year, his labor increased. And each year, the debt remained. Not larger, not smaller. Just present, constant. That constancy mattered. If the debt grew, people might panic. If it shrank, people might hope. So it stayed, adjusted quietly, reshaped to fit new circumstances, absorbing effort without ever releasing pressure. He worked through illness, through injury, through exhaustion. There was no alternative. Missing work did not pause debt. It accelerated it. The body was not owned by the worker. It was collateral. By the time he reached adulthood, work no longer felt like movement. It felt like stasis, like running in place while something heavy pressed down from above. Others told him to be patient, that everyone went through this phase, that stability came later. Later never arrived. Any extra he earned vanished into fees he hadn't known existed. Any small improvement triggered recalculation. The system responded to progress the way a trap responds to pressure. It tightened. He realized slowly that work was not a ladder. It was a leash. It allowed movement only within a fixed radius. Enough to feel alive, not enough to escape. And still, he worked. Because stopping was not rebellion, it was disappearance. Without work, he would become visible in a different way, as a problem, as a liability, as someone to be managed rather than exploited. Work kept him useful. Usefulness kept him tolerated. Freedom was never part of the equation. By the time he understood this fully, the debt no longer felt like something imposed. It felt like something he had always carried. That was the most effective part of the system. When people believed their chains were natural, they stopped looking for the key. There was a moment when he believed he had a choice. Not a dramatic moment. Not a crossroads marked by signs or witnesses. Just a quiet realization that something had to change, and that change, he told himself, could still come from him. The idea arrived disguised as responsibility. If he worked smarter, if he saved longer, if he accepted worse conditions now to gain stability later, the system encouraged this kind of thinking. It made people believe that choice existed everywhere, even when outcomes were fixed. He began to say yes more often, yes to longer days, yes to lower pay, yes to work that bent his body further than it should have bent. Each yes felt like agency, like movement. In reality, each one narrowed the space around him. He considered leaving the village. Others had tried. Some succeeded briefly. They returned quieter, poorer, less willing to talk about what they'd learned. Leaving required permission. Permission required money. Money required time he didn't have. Still, he planned. He counted what he might sell. Calculated how long he could survive without work if something went wrong. Imagined a future that did not include the same debt ledger his father had carried. Imagination was dangerous. It made stagnation visible. When he finally asked what it would take to leave, the answer came quickly, calmly, precisely. A number. A number large enough to be unreachable, but small enough to be framed as possible. The system never said no, it said pay. That was how it turned impossibility into personal failure. He worked harder, slept less, ate worse. Every sacrifice felt justified because it pointed toward an exit that always seemed just out of reach. Months passed, then years. The number never moved closer. Every time he gained ground, something reclaimed it. A fee, a recalculation. A requirement he hadn't known existed until it was added. Choice existed only on paper. In practice, the path was circular. The realization came slowly, not as anger, but as fatigue. The kind of fatigue that doesn't rest in the muscles, but in the will. He wasn't choosing, he was being managed. The system did not force him to stay, it made leaving unattainable. That distinction mattered. It preserved the illusion of freedom while ensuring obedience. By the time he understood this, the question was no longer whether he could escape. It was whether escape had ever been possible at all. Debt remained quiet for a long time. That was its power. As long as payments were made, even barely, the system stayed distant, present, but abstract. Numbers on parchment. Conversations held elsewhere. Then one season, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic, there was no disaster, just accumulation. A delayed payment, a missed adjustment, a fee that arrived after the money had already been spent. Debt doesn't announce itself when it becomes dangerous. It waits until it matters. The notice arrived without urgency, without threat. Written in language that suggested routine rather than consequence. It informed him of a discrepancy. Discrepancies required correction. Correction required payment. The amount was not impossible. That was important. Impossible amounts caused panic. This one caused strain. He paid what he could, promised the rest. Promises were noted, not trusted. From that point on, the system watched him more closely. Not openly, subtly. Requests took longer to process. Permissions came with conditions. Work opportunities shrank in ways that were difficult to trace. Debt had become active. He felt it in the way conversations ended early, in the way options disappeared without explanation, in the way his name began to surface in places it hadn't before. The system did not need to punish him yet. Pressure was enough. He borrowed to cover the gap. Borrowing created new obligations. New obligations created new visibility. Visibility tightened the net. Soon, he was no longer paying to survive. He was surviving to pay. Every coin had a destination before it reached his hand. Every decision was filtered through what it might cost him later. The debt was no longer inherited. It was personal. That made it heavier. When the final notice came, it did not accuse him of wrongdoing. It didn't need to. It reminded him of his position, of what he owed, of what he could lose, and of how easily loss could occur. Debt, once abstract, had become a threat that did not raise its voice. It didn't need to. It had time. There was no single moment when he realized the debt had always been his. It wasn't an epiphany. It wasn't a discovery hidden in a document or revealed by a clerk. It was understanding slow, unavoidable, that nothing he had ever done could have changed his starting point. The debt existed before his first memory, before his first day of work, before his first mistake. It had been waiting. He began to trace it backward in his mind, not as a number, but as a presence. A shadow that moved alongside his life without ever stepping in front of it. Every rule he had followed assumed the debt. Every punishment he feared referenced it. Every promise of improvement quietly depended on it. The system had never expected him to escape. It had prepared him to endure. He thought of the language people used when speaking about debt. Words like responsibility, duty, inheritance. Words that suggested fairness, continuity, logic. None of them mentioned consent. No one asked whether he accepted the terms. No one asked whether he benefited from them. Debt was treated like weather, unavoidable, natural, something you adapted to rather than questioned. When he looked around, he saw the pattern everywhere. Children raised with the same silence. Adults repeating the same rituals. Old men still paying for decisions they had never made. The system didn't need to justify itself. It had normalized itself. The greatest cost of being born into debt was not the money. It was the absence of alternatives. From the beginning, his life had been shaped by limits he never saw being set. Limits that were explained later as consequences, but had existed long before action was possible. Work didn't free him because it was never meant to. Obedience didn't protect him because protection was not the goal. Patience didn't reward him because reward was not part of the structure. The system did not require villains. It required continuity. Every generation carried the same numbers forward, slightly altered, slightly renamed, but never erased. The transfer was seamless, invisible. When his father died, nothing was settled. When he was born, nothing was forgiven. The ledger remained open. That was the price of birth, not hunger, not labor, not even poverty. The price was inevitability. And inevitability was the most effective form of control. The truth was simple enough to say, but difficult to accept. The system did not fail him. It worked exactly as intended. Debt was never designed to be paid by everyone. If it were, it would lose its purpose. A fully paid system would have nothing to enforce, nothing to leverage, nothing to inherit. Debt needed permanence. By attaching it to bloodlines, the system ensured continuity without force. Parents prepared children not for freedom, but for obligation. Children inherited not only names and labor, but expectation. Expectation was cheaper than violence. People who expected to owe did not resist owing. People who expected to work did not ask why work never ended. People who expected scarcity learned to survive within it rather than challenge it. The system did not forbid escape. It priced it. That distinction protected it from blame. Anyone who failed to escape could be told it was their fault. Anyone who stayed could be told they chose to. Anyone who endured could be praised for resilience instead of questioned for exploitation. Language carried the lie. Words like choice, effort, responsibility softened the edges of control. They turned structure into morality. They made suffering feel earned. The system did not need to erase everyone. It only needed to erase alternatives. By the time people realized there was no exit, they no longer remembered what an exit would look like. That was the final cruelty. Not that people were trapped, but that they stopped imagining freedom. If you want to understand how debt became a sentence written at birth, how money replaced chains without changing the outcome, and how entire lives were shaped before choice ever entered the picture, subscribe. Because this story was not unique. It was inherited,